Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Dan Reese, and I'm the local Parks Grant Program Manager. And you're all here this afternoon because you have either recently been awarded a new local park grant with federal funds, or you have an active grant with federal funds. For those of you that are new grant awardees, first let me start by congratulating you. Everyone in attendance today has made it this far. You've made it through the application process. And now it's time for the fun to begin. For those of you who have been in this position in the past, you know that we would typically be having this presentation at our offices here in Austin. Unfortunately, we're not able to do that this year, and so we would like to encourage everyone to type in your questions as we make our way through the presentation. I'm sure most of you have used the GoToMeeting platform over the last year and a half or so, but if you haven't, you'll see a little control panel there on the right-hand side of your screen. If you hit the little arrow next to where it says questions, that's where we'd like you to type your questions in. And we'll do our best to address these questions throughout the presentation. We'll also give everyone an opportunity to ask questions at the conclusion of today's webinar. We are planning on we are recording today's presentation, so we will make this available to everyone, as well as a PDF of the PowerPoint that you'll be viewing throughout the webinar. Both of these files will be located in the local park resources section in Argo 2020. And I'm sure most of you are very familiar with Argo 2020 if you've made it this far in our process. But you will be learning a little more about that later this afternoon. So here's what we have on tap for you today. Here's our agenda. So first, I'll get things kicked off here just with a few welcomes and introductions. When I'm done, Blake Powers will jump on and he'll run through our online management system, Rec Grants Online, or Argo 2020. Essentially, those of you that have just been awarded a grant, your login and everything will stay the same. Essentially, the portal that you use to submit your application will now be used to administer your grant. When Blake's done, our fiscal team will be joining us, and they'll run through all of your fiscal related project management tasks. Once the fiscal portion of the presentation is done, we'll take a 10 or 15 minute break, and then the local park team will jump on, and we'll be covering all of your programmatic requirements and regulations, and essentially everything you've got to look forward to over the next several years. And then again, we'll open the virtual floor up for questions. But again, I encourage everyone to use the questions feature there on the right-hand side of your screen, and please feel free to ask questions along the way. If you do have a question that's maybe more project specific, or you prefer not to ask it in an open forum, that's fine. We'll provide all of our contact information, and you're certainly always welcome to give us a call or send us an email. So I mentioned some of the introductions. Here's a little bit of the management team here at Recreation Grants. That's Dana Lagarde there on the top left. Dana's our director. Many of you probably know Dana or have worked with her in the past. That's me there at the top right. Again, I'm the manager of the local park grant program here. Blake Powers there on the bottom left. Blake's our business systems and communications administrator. Most of you have probably worked with Blake if you've, again, made it this far while you were setting up your sponsor accounts and kind of making your way through the application process. And that's Pam Cavey, our fiscal manager there on the bottom right. Pam will be joined by the remainder of the fiscal team later this afternoon as they make their way through their portion of the presentation. and she'll make those introductions when they begin their presentation. And then here's the real heavy hitters of the local park team. These are the local park grant coordinators. At this point, you've probably all heard from your specific project coordinator several times and probably even met with them on site. Your grant coordinator will be your primary point of contact throughout the life of your grant. With that said, we do all travel quite a bit. So if you're ever in a pinch and you've got a question that needs a timely response and you're unable to get in touch with your coordinator, please feel free to contact any one of us, and we'll certainly do our best to assist you. Aaron, Susan, and Matt have all been with the program for a number of years, and they'll do an excellent job assisting you with administering your project. And we do have a current vacancy on the local park team, and that's our compliance coordinator. We are hoping to fill that position in the next several weeks, and eventually the compliance coordinator will be who you'll be hearing from when we do come out and perform inspections well after your grant closes. So I don't see any questions at this point in time. Again, I encourage you to feel free to type questions in throughout the presentation today. And that's pretty much it for me. So at this point, I'm going to slide over and I'm going to let Blake Powers take over.
Hi, everybody. My name is Blake Powers. I'm the Systems Administrator for Recreation Grants. My role with Recreation Grants is primarily to administer the Argo 2020 grant management system. So today we're just going to talk a little bit about how to use the system to successfully manage a grant project. We're not going to go too in depth here because there are many, many resources that you can look at after the webinar at a different time. And in order to access more specific instructions. What I want to give to you today are some conceptual ways to know how to use the system to manage a project. And we'll look at those together, and hopefully you'll have an overall idea of how the system will help you manage your project from the sponsor side. First, we'll talk a little bit about what Argo 2020 is. It's a grant portal that's primarily designed to manage projects all the way from the application stage of the workflow, which is when you're applying for a project. It's not even a project yet, it's an application, to the point where it becomes a project and then eventually where it completes. The applications in the new system belong to sponsor organizations rather than individual users. That is a little bit different. For those of you that use the old system, you may remember that all you had to do was log in with an email address and you could start an application, and the application basically belonged to whoever was a part of it using the email address. Well, for the purposes of keeping our program viable and continuing to provide assistance to communities throughout the state of Texas, part of what we have to do is produce legislative reporting, and there's political constituents that want to see different numbers about how things are funded. And in order for us to produce those reports, we have to associate projects with sponsor organizations. This is also an audit best practice, since the grant agreements are issued to organizations rather than individual users. So that is something different. The other thing to remember is that you interface with the application based on your role. And really, there are a couple roles you can have. You can be a sponsor administrator or sponsor staff. There's also a sponsor viewer role, but that would technically be for somebody that's not going to do anything on the project. They just may need to look at some of the forms. So depending on which of those roles you have, you can do different things in the system. And then if you are a sponsor administrator for your organization, you can add and remove folks from the organization at large. You can also add and remove folks from the organization's projects, right, which would be however many applications that you have as an organization. What we're going to talk about first is the first element of managing your project. and that is to be able to provide different benchmark documentation, okay? In the old system, you may remember that everything was on one large task list, and if you never interfaced with the old system, then don't worry about that. But if you did, you remember that when you logged in, there was just one big screen with a whole bunch of tasks. In the new system, that concept has been replaced by a form called the project elements form. And what will happen is essentially very similar to the old system. Our staff will add tasks or items that are required to the project elements form. You will receive an email that a task has been added. Now in the new system, when a task has been added, there's a little link right here. And when you click this link, it provides an associated document that goes with the task, right? So this is a form, and when you click this link, it gives you a blank copy of the AP 15210s form, which you then fill out and upload, right? Sometimes these will be instructions on how to provide documentation for the task, okay? So occasionally there'll be forms, occasionally there'll be instructions for how to complete the task and what kind of document that we want for fulfillment. And other times there'll simply be an acknowledgement. For example, you may get an acknowledgement or at some point you may receive a notice to proceed. That's going to link to a document that basically you acknowledge that you've received that notice, right? So that's kind of this form. This is going to be a place where we can add required tasks and elements for your project, and you can provide the documentation that goes with them, okay? There is a full guide to this task, and you will see it if you click the link on this slide right here. It will take you to the page where the awarded and active project resources are. And this PowerPoint will be available within a few days after this webinar. But I'll also, before the end of this presentation, I'll show you on the website where you can find some of this stuff, okay? All right, this next thing is something you're not gonna do very often. Theoretically, you're only gonna do it once, unless you request an amendment, but that is signing a grant agreement, okay? That's a pretty fundamental part of getting a grant. So basically in the Argo 2020 system, the grant agreements are automated to an extent, okay? There's a primary portion of the agreement that you have to sign in the link to agreement PDF. And again, the full guide to this is in the awarded active project resources, and I'll show you that in a minute. But you'll use the agreement signatures form to do this, okay? The primary part of the agreement will be using the link to PDF button, and then there'll be attachments below that, okay? Some of the attachments are included as a reference point. For example, your approved budget may be included as an attachment. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have to sign the budget, all right? But it is referenced in the agreement, so it is made part of this form, okay? Other elements that are on this form, other attachments, you may have to sign, okay? An instruction for approved projects may not require a signature, but you know, there may be some different items on that list that require signature, okay? A key thing to remember is that you'll obviously need to sign the main portion of the agreement, and then anything else here that requires signature, you'll want to click to download the link to that item, and then if you are required to sign that item as well, you'll want to scan these together as one file and upload them as your signed executed grant agreement, okay? And again, the instructions that I'll show you are very specific about how to complete this from a technical perspective, all right? So the next key component to managing a grant is a quarterly report, right? That's required of every grant that comes out of our recreation grants area. In the prior system, you had to go in and initiate your own quarterly report. In the new system, that report is generated for you, okay? So you don't have to start it, you just have to finish it and submit it, all right? On the first of each month that follows the end of the previous reporting quarter, you're going to get an email alerting you that there's a quarterly report ready for your organization, okay? When you log into the Argo 2020 system at that time, that quarterly report will show up on your home screen in the My Tasks area, okay? Now, something that's really important to remember with these quarterly reports, and again, there's a full guide to filling this out, complete with step-by-step instructions, okay? The key thing to remember is that in this system, when you're done and you've completed the information in a form, that doesn't alert our office that it's ready to review. What alerts our office is when you status change the document to the next phase of the workflow, okay? So the status change in the new system replaces the submit option in the old system. So just something to keep in mind with all of these different items. You won't have to use a submit or a status change option for the project elements form. That is a standalone form. But for all these other processes, you'll have to do something and then status change to the next stage of the workflow. For example, after you've uploaded your signed grant agreement, you'll have to status change it into the agreement review stage so that we can look at it. After you've completed your quarterly report, you'll have to status change it into submit it, okay? Most of you are somewhat aware of this because when you fill out your application for a grant, in order to submit it to our office to review, remember you had to status change the application into application submitted, okay? So you'll just want to get familiar with that status change feature in the new system. Again, this is covered really extensively in the resources. So all of the guides are very clear about what you need to do in order to have our staff review something that you've provided for us, okay? So we talked about the project elements, all right? That's our main benchmark area. And this is something you may have to fill out before you sign your grant agreement. And then you'll sign your grant agreement, and then the quarterly reports, right? That's 3 elements. Fourth one is the payment and reimbursement request, okay? In the old system, the payment reimbursement request is just a task like every other task on the screen. There could be 50 things for you to do, and one of them says request a reimbursement. In the new system, reimbursements are a complete standalone feature. You can track them individually. You'll see how much you have available on your grant balance. You'll see how much match you've recorded. The reimbursement process in the new system offers far more information for you to manage your project successfully, okay? But the key to this will be that the reimbursement request form will allow you to submit documentation for eligible expenses, and the form will use the budget details form from your applications. You can only submit one request at a time, all right? Part of the reason why is when we have a system that updates the totals of the available balance and you have a previous request that hasn't been verified yet, the second request wouldn't have an accurate balance for you to draw from, right? So we have to reach the point in the audit process where the money is deducted from the budget as it stands at that time before we can move to the next request, okay? And also you'll use the system to sign your certification letter. For those of you that have received payments before, you know that's typically had to be done through a different means, but now that is automated, okay? Again, there is an extensive guide to the reimbursements in the awarded active project resources, okay? And then there's really one more thing that you may have to use, and again, your grant team will get into this with you, so you may not have to use it as much, but that is the amendment and revision request feature. That is essentially if you need a change of scope on your project, if you need a change to budget, and which may or may not be viable depending on the terms of your grant agreement, or if you need an extension to your project. Now, again, some of these things have changed. Some projects no longer are going to be eligible for extensions, but I'll let the grant team get into that. But the amendment workflow basically is the workflow you enter if you need fundamentally some sort of change to the agreement or the one of the elements of the grant agreement, like a budget or an extension. Okay, and essentially this guide will help you submit a revision request. If it's approved, it will progress through the workflow. The guide covers that as well, okay? So just to review one more time, project elements form will help you submit benchmark items. Obviously, you have to sign your grant agreement. You're gonna have to submit quarterly reports, that's required, and you're gonna have to submit payment reimbursement draws, and that is required too. Those are really the only 4 things that you absolutely must do to manage your grant in the system. And the 5th one would be the amendment revision request. So overall, that's a very high level view of how the system would be will be used throughout the course of managing your project. And what we'll take a look at real quick is I'll pull control from my other computer here. So what I'd like to show everybody here is even if you don't have a login to the Argo 2020 system here, if you're able to get to the home screen here, there's an area that says resources, okay? And in this resources area, these links from the PowerPoint will direct you down to the awarded active project resources, okay? And these guides are extremely specific. So for example, we talked about the project elements form, right? This guide walks you step by step on getting the email, how to find your application, right? It teaches you how to search the application tab to find the application that this is referred to. It shows you how to pull up the form set. It shows you how to identify which project is yours. It shows you how to save the forms, how to upload required documentation. So all of the information is here in these resources that you're going to need for your projects. The most important thing to remember is where this page is, okay? And it is in these Argo 2020 resources. You're going to find some other stuff there too. You're going to find local park grant program resources. This webinar is going to be located on here within a few days after completion, all right? So get really familiar with the Argo 2020 resources, not just at a programmatic level, but at the level where you're able to complete the required benchmark tasks in the system. And so this page that we're looking at, let me pull back to my other machine here. So this page of the slide just reinforces links to the local park grant program resources, links to the Argo 2020 Quick Start User Guide. Most of you already know that information. That's more for people that are applying in the system. And then the links to the awarded active project resources. You can always email us at rec.grants@tpwd.texas.gov or give us a call. And if that is a technical question that requires my help, I'll get that message and I'll follow up with you. My goal is to make it eminently easier and less confusing for you to be able to use the system to manage your project successfully. So appreciate your time. And if you think of any questions after the fact, even if you don't have any right now, again, the purpose of the webinar is just to kind of give you an overview of Argo 2020, not to show you how to use every single thing because the resources do that. But if something comes up, feel free to email us, or you can, in Argo 2020, there is a support link. It's a blue tab that pops up. That email goes to me, or you can always just use the information in the slide to contact me directly, and we'll be sure to get any questions answered that you might have. So that concludes my portion of the presentation, and I'm going to hand the reins over to our fiscal manager, Pam KB.
Greetings and welcome to the Fiscal Grant Management segment of this afternoon's webinar. We are going to share some resources and tips for all things fiscal. So if it has a $sign associated with it, we're going to be your go-to people. I'd like to start by sharing you a little bit about our fiscal team. Marcy has been with Rec Grants for 8.5 years. Not only is she an auditor, she is our resident appraisal expert and either reviews or coordinates with our contract reviewer for all, our contracted reviewer for all appraisals, and we'll be able to answer any questions she has regarding your yellow book appraisals. She's going to give a quick overview of the appraisal process. Michael's been with Rec Grants for going on 3 years. He is going to provide you with an overview of the reimbursement process and give you some great tips to make the process a little easier to navigate as you start initiating your reimbursements for the first time in Argo 2020. Following his wrap up He's going to give you some great tips for success that's just really going to help expedite and move your reimbursements through the process and prevent fewer follow-up questions. Mary Helen has been with the team for just over a year and a half. Mary Helen's primarily the auditor for another program within Rec Grants, but she's been auditing reimbursements in the new Argo 2020 system more than any of us and has become the unofficial train the trainers resources. Any member of the fiscal team can answer any reimbursement questions you might have, or we'll find the answer for you. And I'm Pam Cavey. I'm the fiscal manager. I have been in this job for 2 years, and I'm very excited to share with you Argo 2020 and the tools that it provides you. I've been in grants for a long time. I'm not going to say how many years to give away age, but I've just been doing this for a long time. And the tool that you have at your fingertips in Argo 2020 is by far one of the best ones that's out there. We're very excited about it. I'm going to provide some resources and talk a little bit more about some of your pre-agreement elements and your post-agreement elements. Most of these you're going to find in the grant elements tab or form that Blake has shared with you. Many of you have already completed your pre-agreement elements, the AP 152 and the direct deposit form. If you have not done that, and it is out there as a project element for you to complete, we encourage you to get that done as soon as possible. I would also like to share with you times that the AP 152 may become part of post-award element, because the AP 152 is your official sponsor, an official supplier address in our accounting system. So if you change addresses or if you change banks at any time during the life cycle of your project, you will need to complete a new AP 152. If you have direct deposit and you change your address, then you will also need to submit a new direct deposit authorization form, since the address on both forms will link for your reimbursement. Also, just make sure that you sign and date both forms. That has been a reason we have had to send those back in the past. On your direct deposit authorization, again, it's very important that the address matches on the AP 152. And if you change one, you need to change the other. So at some point, these may also become documents that are part of the post-award documents. Just a little tip, Section 5 is often overlooked on the direct deposit authorization and will be reason for your authorization to be rejected by the state comptroller. And this is regarding whether or not you identifying if you are sending your funds to an international institution, and because of the Patriot Act and other federal regulations, if you miss this box, your direct deposit form will be rejected and will not connect to your address. So just a little bit of a tip, make sure Section 5 is always completed. If you ever have any questions on completing these forms, please do not hesitate to reach out. We do try to review them before we send them to the state comptroller. So we will try to, we usually catch if there's any omitted information up front. Again, as has shared with you, your project elements is the form that has what we used to call your task, or now your elements. And if you have been assigned any documents or any tasks to be completed, this is where you're going to find the information. During the procurement process and during the financial piece of your project, all of our guidance is based on one premise, that all procurement transactions will be conducted in a manner that provides full and open competition. We do not really have prescribed procurement methods. because that is going to be established by your own internal procurement policy. We always first refer you to the your own internal policy, and then take it out to make sure it's not in conflict with the federal or any other state guidance that we might have. One of the exceptions to that is how the requirement for construction contracts and what has to be procured through a sealed bid process. Remember that your sealed bid process requires formal and public advertisement for invitation for bids. All bids have to be publicly opened at a prescribed time and place. Develop and maintain a bid tabulation sheet in all bids opened. If the committee, the selection committee, chooses to go with a bid that is not the low bid, you must provide sound documented reason why the low bid was not accepted. We will have a few sponsors who choose to use the local government purchasing cooperative, otherwise known as buy board, in lieu of the sealed bid procurement process, and that is acceptable. But there are some additional requirements that will be associated with that. So if that is your procurement method, I encourage you to reach out to either myself or your grant coordinator, and they can forward your communication with me, because there's just some things we would need to outline up front as to what's going to be required. And the first one that we're going to ask for you to provide is that you have authority to participate in the cooperative. Authority being either by your own written procurement policy or by some type of a action by your trustees, your commission, whoever your governing body is. If you do not have it in your policy that you have allowable authority for the cooperative, you will have to get special permission for that to happen. The second document that we would ask for is a copy of the executed interlocal agreement that is between you and the cooperative. Those two documents have to happen up front before you can even pursue procuring through buy board. So again, please contact your grant coordinator or myself, the fiscal manager, for individual guidance when you're ready to proceed with that process. Along the lines of contracts, let's talk about contract change orders. Before you sign a construction change order that includes a scope of project, a project cost increase, or completion date extension, please clear with your grant coordinator first. That an amendment to the project's budget, sometimes that may require an amendment to the project's budget summary that is not allowable cost, or puts you outside of the date time frame for a period of performance. So I just cannot stress that enough. If you have, before you sign a contract change order and commit your entity to a contract with your contractor, please visit with your grant coordinator first to make sure that that is not going to put you in conflict with anything with your local agreement. Because please remember that the local agreement is what guides your contract and your obligations with TPWD, and a change order on your contract will not change your local agreement with us. So just keep in mind, change orders do have some implications that we really need you to stay in contact with us for. Again, just to reiterate that all construction-related documents must include project number and project name. And the following documents will be requested prior to reimbursement. Proof of your public invitation to bid. That should be a tear sheet showing the posting. And of course, tear sheet used to be the terminology we applied to print documents and print advertising. Now most of us are posting online, so tear sheet would be an electronic document that shows confirmation that you have advertised with an online site and identifying what that site was. your bid tabulation sheet, including documentation of low bid not selected, and the signed contract itself. Submission would be through the ARGO 2020, the project elements form that we have shown you. I'm now going to turn it over to Marcy, and she's going to talk about the appraisals and the fact that it's a yellow book appraisal as it relates to federal projects. We are monitoring the questions. So if you have any questions from what's been presented or what you're about to hear, please drop them in the question box on the webinar, and we will either answer you today or we will respond to you today that it's something that we would have to look at, and we'll get back with you. So again, we welcome you, and if there's anything that we can do or any guidance that we can provide you as you begin to navigate your reimbursement process down the road, please do not hesitate to reach out to us. Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Marcy Cavazos Colunga, and I will be giving you a brief overview of the appraisal process for federally funded grant projects. If you have a grant project that includes land acquisition, you'll need to submit an appraisal report for review. This will be based on your original grant application and will be outlined in your land acquisition schedule. To check to see if you have to submit one, you'll want to navigate to the project elements in the system. Once you are in project elements, look at the required project elements to be uploaded. If an appraisal report is required for your project, it will be listed here with your other required elements. For federally funded grant projects, a yellow book appraisal is required. This is where you will need to upload your appraisal report, and it will trigger the appraisal review process. Today's webinar is for federally funded grants, so you'll need to submit a yellow book appraisal if one is required. In addition to the standard appraisal components here, we will be looking for yellow book conformity. A certified appraiser is familiar with all these standard components in an appraisal report. However, we strongly recommend that you hire an appraiser that is experienced with yellow book appraisal preparation. After our initial appraisal review, you will get a system-generated notification letting you know whether your appraisal report was either approved or is on hold. If it has not been approved, we will let you know what needs to be remedied in the report for it to be approved. At this point, you will want to talk with your appraiser to revise the report to remedy those deficient items. Here are the top reasons that it might not get approved when you submit it. So again, talk to your appraiser to update the appraisal report to bring it to compliance if that is the case. Once you receive your updated report from your appraiser, you will need to upload the revised report in the same area in the system where you originally uploaded the report. This will start the review process again, where we will look to see if the updated report is now compliant. Once the revised report is received and accepted, you will receive a system-generated notification letting you know that your appraisal has been approved. That will complete your appraisal requirement at that point. If you're wondering how long the appraisal process takes, the short answer is, it depends. If the appraisal is close to perfect the first time it gets submitted, it might get approved. If your appraisal is not approved the first time it gets submitted, it will depend on how quickly your appraiser completes the updated report. That's it for appraisals. Thank you. And now Mike Garza will talk about our reimbursement process.
Thank you, Marcy. Once again, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Garza, and I am one of the auditors you will be in contact with when you submit a reimbursement request. I'll give you an overview of the key pieces of documentation you will need to successfully request reimbursement from TPWD recreational grants. I'll also show you where to locate your reimbursement request guide in Article 2020 for future reference. So the key items in every reimbursement package you're going to submit, preferably in this order, are going to be the budget summary, the billing matrix, the invoices and proof of payment, horse account and equipment documentation, and certification page. So first, I will show you where to get that resource from. So as you can see on the home page right here at the bottom, on the screenshot at the bottom of the screen, you're going to click where it says Argo 2020 resources, and then that will take you to this page, and then you're going to scroll down to number 6, where the arrow is pointing, and that's where you'll get your resource guide from for any questions you may have during the reimbursement process. So for starters, here's the budget summary. The budget summary is an integrated form and will auto-populate with the approved budget elements of your project. The sample I have on screen is to give you an idea on how it will look. With each reimbursement request, the system will update the reimbursement request number, but you must enter the period covered for each reimbursement request. Keep in mind, the cost must be correctly categorized to the construction elements on the left, and these entries should match the billing matrix and backup documentation. The total project cost at the bottom of the completed the total project cost at the bottom should match the payments, and it should give the gross amount spent for all your expenses. And per your grant agreement for local parks, you'll be reimbursed at 50% of that, of whatever your total cost come out to be. So this is the billing matrix. The billing matrix, as I mentioned, needs to be completed in its entirety to submit each reimbursement request. The figures here will need to tie back to the approved cost categories that were in the budget summary in the previous slide. The sample I have on screen is to give you an idea of how it should look. You will also complete this documentation for construction pay apps, which I will elaborate on in a moment, invoices, and detailed cash receipts. In order to accept checks as proof of payment, checks require a front and back scan that show that it was paid and processed by the bank. Procurement cards, credit cards, and ACH or electronic funds transfer related the costs that are made or expenses that are paid for require a bank statement or a credit card statement to show that the payment has been made using your resources in house. Cash transactions require a petty cash transaction log to show where the cash came from for the expenses you're paying for. Next is the force account. Essentially, force accounts are just timesheets and payroll registers that are required for projects with approved personnel budget lines. And the same thing goes for equipment. If your budget allows for you to use any equipment for your project, you would put that the equipment used and the project scope, and you have to log the amount of time that the amount of time that you use whatever equipment that you are using for your project. I've posted a sample of our standardized form that we offer to sponsors, but it is not required if you have your own. If you provide your own work record for your employees and equipment usage, that's acceptable as long as you make sure to provide the same information shown here on your version. Okay, and then pay apps. So construction pay apps are sometimes used for submitting expenses for construction-related grants. And these include the important aspects that we need to have identified for us to audit these. Includes the payment application date, the payment application number, the contract total, the total amount completed, any amount held for retainage, and the certified amount due. And one big piece of advice I would give, or a big tip, is if you provide if you're submitting a reimbursement request and it includes a pay app, please include the schedule to identify which costs are being claimed. Pay apps by nature are very large and include costs that may not be applicable to your grant. By doing this will speed up the review of your pay app and avoid unnecessary delays in the audit process. And then finally, the certification page will be the final step in completing your reimbursement request. The certification page may look familiar to some of you who've had a grant with us in the past. It is now going to be auto-generated at the end of after the end of the reimbursement review has been audited and reviewed. You will receive an email notification when the certification is ready to be downloaded, signed, and status changed to move the reimbursement to the next stage. Per your grant agreement, as I mentioned, you'll receive 50% of the gross cost that was included in your budget summary and in your billing matrix. So to do a quick recap, because I know I went through a lot of information, I'll do a quick recap. So first, when you submit a reimbursement request, you're going to fill out the budget summary in its entirety, as well as the billing matrix. You're going to provide invoices, pay apps if applicable, receipts, and proof of payment for all costs related to the grant in the same order listed in your billing matrix. Proof of payment may consist of checks, electronic funds transfer, P-card, credit card charges, and detailed cash receipts. Make sure bank records are provided to prove that the charges in question have been paid with your resources. And then finally, you will submit your certification form as soon as possible with the correct amount when you receive notification to complete it. And the tips for success that were mentioned earlier by Pam consist of these. Always submit your reimbursement request within a timely manner. Organize your supporting documentation in the same order listed on the matrix with proof of payment immediately following each proof of cost. Remember to save after uploading the supporting documentation. Remember to status change when submitting the reimbursement request and after uploading the signed certification. Utilize the Argo 2020 resource guide that I showed you at the beginning of this section of the presentation, and that will always be available for you. And if all else fails, you can always call us if you need assistance before submitting a partially complete request. And I know that you guys can't really type right now, so just know that whatever questions are being asked are being recorded from the chat, and we will answer those questions at the conclusion of the presentation. Thank you, and you can go ahead and take a break until 2:30.
All right, welcome back, everybody. We had a break till 2:30. I know we said 15-minute break, but we're gonna get picked up here again. We have a long way to go and a short time to get there. So we're gonna keep rocking and rolling. Now that you've had some experience with the Argo 2020 system and the fiscal responsibilities, now we're gonna roll into the actual management of your grant and how you can get into construction. Okay. So just real quick, just a brief overview of this section. How we're going to break this out is we need to spend some time about project timing. These are federally funded grants, and so we have to work with the National Park Service. And so we really want to drive home some of the timing that you can expect for some of these grant agreements. Then we'll actually go through the grant agreement phases and what it takes to actually execute these agreements. And then we'll actually go through the actual tasks that you'll have to complete once you receive a grant agreement in order to work through your project and get into construction and get you finally, and then we'll go through the closeout process. So first off, we're going to start off with just what you can expect for some timing. But before we do that, we just want to talk about some funding sources really quick. So this is a federally funded presentation, so we're only focused on the monies that we receive from the National Park Service. And so we want to kind of differentiate and explain some of that funding source and how it's going to be managed. So first off, these monies do come from offshore oil and gas royalties. They're mainly through the Land and Water Conservation Fund, but we do get some monies from the Gulf of Mexico Energy and Securities Act. But mainly you will be focused with Land and Water Conservation Fund monies. And the real distinction on your grant agreements and how you know if you're state or federally funded is we'll have these fund IDs that's going to be on your grant agreement. And any grant project number that starts with a 48, that's an automatic to let you know that you have a federally funded project. One thing we'd like to mention is last year, about this time, last August in 2020, the president signed into law the Great American Outdoors Act. And so what that is in the past, the federal government had the authority to allocate funds how they thought was appropriate at the time. And so not always was those funds from the offshore oil and gas royalties fully appropriated or given to the states to use for local park grants and the Land and Water Conservation Fund. Well, the Great American Outdoors Act has really changed that. Now that's basically a full-on dedication. So the monies the feds receive for those offshore oil and gas royalties, they now give it to the Land and Water Conservation Fund. And so essentially that means the apportionments for the states for these local park grants has gone up because now it's a full dedication and that increased the funds. The only issue with that is, like the old added saying is, more money, more problems. Well, that's exactly what we're seeing now with the passage of the Great American Outdoors Act. Is the National Park Service has really tightened up a lot of their policies. They've even changed some of their manuals, and so there's a lot more requirements in order to actually get grant agreements in place and actually start working on projects. Which we understand, they're trying to reduce risk and trying to be more accountable with all these extra funds they've received. But the biggest problem that we've had is by the time they've made these policy changes, we were already in the middle of grant agreements and receiving applications. So during this first section, I'm going to try to do the best that I can to really differentiate, because we have some folks on this call who applied in 2019. And then with, the COVID-19 pandemic and other issues, we had to delay actual getting approvals through our commission. And then also with these changes based on the Great American Outdoors Act, that really delayed the grant agreement process. So we know and we understand that some of the folks on this call, you have not received a grant agreement yet. They're in the queue at the federal level, but they have not been submitted and sent down to Parks and Wildlife yet. So I'm going to try to do my best to kind of give you some information for the projects that are really close to getting a grant agreement. And then I'm also going to try to talk and give some sense to the folks that were awarded this last May. And we've already had your site visits, and we just submitted your documentation to the National Park Service. So there's kind of two different types of folks on here. And I'm going to try to do my best to kind of give you the best guidance and timelines for both of those. Okay. So, but first off, starting out, this is, really for those folks that they applied last year in 2020 and they were, approved by our Parks and Wildlife Commission in May of 2021. The biggest change with the Great American Outdoors Act and how NPS manages their grants is now they want everything, all the permitting and any kind of environmental or cultural reviews, any kind of permitting requirements, they want all those done ahead of a grant agreement. And that is a major change. In the past, we were able to get a grant agreement in place, but they would just put a special condition saying that no construction could begin until all the, pre-construction, all the permitting, all those tasks were complete. But, now they're saying, no, we're not even going to give you a grant agreement until you have all those permits done. And so that's a real game changer. If there's an archaeological survey or any kind of sensitive environmental resources on your site, these are all things that, you at the local community are going to have to get done and approved and get concurrence letters for before we can even submit to the National Park Service. And, most of the newer grants, you had a chance to kind of talk that through during your pre-agreement site visits with your project or your grant coordinator. And so some of y'all were able to actually get a lot of those tasks done, or some of them your project didn't even didn't apply to your project. You just didn't have any kind of sensitive resources. So we were able to submit your projects without any conditions like that. But basically, we did submit the majority of the federal grants during the July 31st, 2021 submission window. And so that was if we had all the ARC surveys, all the requirements done, or if your project didn't have any of that, we were able to submit them in July. Now, if some of your projects, you're still working on some of those, permitting requirements, whether it's an ARC survey or, an environmental assessment or something to that effect, the next window for us to submit is the December-January window. And so we're not even going to be able to submit to the National Park Service until then. Okay, now the next thing to really think about is we submit it during these windows, but that doesn't mean we have a grant agreement yet. And something important to really think about is, you at the local level will never work with the National Park Service directly. You will only work with us at Parks and Wildlife. But us at Parks and Wildlife, we're the ones that have an agreement with the National Park Service. So although we've submitted your documentation to NPS, now we have to wait to get a grant agreement from them to Parks and Wildlife. And in the past, especially before the Great American Outdoors Act and all these changes, we would usually expect those within a few months. If we were kind of going on standard timelines, we would say if we submitted in July, you should have a grant agreement by September of 2021. Similar, if we submitted in January, we would expect a March of 2022 grant agreement date. However, with all of these changes that they've implemented, especially with the pandemic still going on and active, and just a ton of more money, which more money, more projects, more issues, more staffing, more all kinds of, it's a snowball effect essentially. So there have been some significant delays. And for those of you that are on here that, you applied in 2019 and, we got your grant agreements and we got all your documentation in during the April window of 2021, we are still waiting for a grant agreement from the National Park Service. Now, we did receive some good news that those are going to start trickling in here. However, we don't want to speculate when we might actually see those agreements, but we're really hoping we're getting to the lights at the end of the tunnel for that, and we're hoping we're really going to start seeing those grant agreements for those folks that applied in 2019 that are still waiting on a grant agreement. Now, for you folks that applied last year and we submitted during the July window, we're hoping for a September grant agreement date. It might more likely be, say, fall of this year. But again, we're really just at the mercy of federal process. And us at Parks and Wildlife, the ball's out of our court at that point. Like, we really want to help push things along, but it's at the pace of the federal government and the National Park Service. So if you'll please, we just ask for some patience. We're trying to do the best we can to push these through. And we're hoping that for those folks that submitted in July, that you have a fall grant agreement date so that we can get you started. Now, the last thing is there's a grant agreement between Parks and Wildlife and the local sponsor. So again, Parks and Wildlife is just the pass-through entity. We work with the National Park Service and we get an agreement from MPS and TPWD. Well, then we turn around and we give you at the local level an agreement between your organization and us at Parks and Wildlife. And so that's another process that we'll work through. But again, once we get that ball in our court, we'll start really pushing forward to get those through. But one of the things that we're going to have before we can do that is the AP and TINS form. And fiscal and everybody's gone over that pretty well already. But essentially, that's the paperwork we need to actually get you set up in our business system and get you paid. So we can't get a grant agreement until we have those. So as soon as you see those tasks, some of you have already done that. We've already collected that from you. But that's something we're definitely going to have to get you a local agreement. And then finally, once you have the local agreement, once you have your contract in place and the local agreement, you can start working on your pre-construction task and getting into construction and hopefully getting y'all some reimbursements. And at the end of the day, hopefully finally get you a park on the ground so that your people can enjoy it. But again, we wanted to give you kind of some ideas of what we're dealing with. We're really trying to push these along, but it's just a big process and a mess at the federal level that we're hoping to start working through some of that, and in the future we'll start streamlining that. But there's just some growing pains between the pandemic and then the change of the Great American Outdoors Act. So bear with us, we're going to get you started as soon as we can. Okay, so I wanted to go into a little more detail about the pre-agreement compliance. Some of y'all have had a chance to deal with that. Some of y'all had ARC surveys that you had to do within a month, and y'all really stepped up and got it done. But we wanted to kind of go through some of these different compliance issues that we're having to deal with before we can even submit and get a grant agreement in place. The first one is, again, the National Historic Preservation Act, basically Section 106, that has to deal with, archaeological surveys and any cultural resources that are on site. We have to make sure that you work with the Texas Historical Commission and get concurrence letters from them and clearance, especially if you have to do an ARC survey. Basically, Texas Historical Commission is the ones that's going to handle that for us, but until we get concurrence from them, we can't submit for a grant agreement. National Environmental Protection Act, that's really just environmental concerns. And one of the big game changers here is if your project includes acquisition and development, that means you have basically raw land that's going to be developed. You're going to have to do an environmental assessment for that. So that was a change that we've seen. And so you would either have to consult that out, or maybe you have some folks on staff that are qualified to provide those environmental assessments. But that's something that's new that you might have to do for your project. Then again, if you already have an established park or maybe land that you've already been managing, but there are some sensitive resources on that site, wetlands or anything like that, you might still have to do what's an environmental assessment on that project. So the biggest thing with that is, not every project has to do that. We do have what's called a categorical exclusion, which is, if your project fits within a certain checkbox of, there's not really environmental concerns or sensitive resources, and maybe it's low impact, you're not going to have a whole landscape level disturbance, we can incorporate what's called a categorical exclusion, but that's not for every project. And so we're really seeing that a lot of these environmental assessments are becoming just parts of grant projects now. Floodplain management and wetland protections. These are executive orders. Basically, they want to see evidence that you have proof of insurance for working in floodplains, and that what the development policies are in floodplains. We're really working with NPS right now. This was a new question and a new guidance they've been given to us, and so we're trying to find some more examples of what they're really looking for. But really, the big overall idea is, if we're working in a floodplain and we fund a project and we put, $750,000 into a project, they want to ensure that those facilities are going to be there and usable and accessible for the minimum of 25 years. We expect the life expectancy for any facilities to last 25 years. And so if you're building in a floodplain and all that gets washed away with, before 25 years, they're going to want to know that you have some kind of process or some kind of catch-all that's going to say that you're going to be able to replace those facilities and keep those up and running, even if it's in a floodplain. All right. Endangered Species Act, sometimes there are sensitive resources where there could be endangered species on your site. And so if they get flagged for that, you will have to work with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and get, contractors or consultants that can help you do surveying and then, do site assessments and get approval through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service based on those habitat and those species requirements. Special coordination with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And I mean, this is a real game changer, y'all. I mean, in the past, we get a grant agreement and, they put that special condition that, no construction can start until we get these in place. Well, as you all, probably know, if, working with the U.S. Army Corps, it can be a very lengthy and difficult process. So we're really trying to give our guidance now to get people to start focusing on those ahead of a grant application. But again, by the time we've received a lot of this guidance, we already had applications in review, already had projects approved, and so we're kind of behind the ball on some of that guidance. But essentially, they want any Army Corps of Engineer involvement to be cleared as well. So that has to deal with any kind of wetlands or navigable waterways, jurisdictional waters of the U.S., those types of things. Sometimes that can just involve, changing of design a little bit, but sometimes that is like full coordination with the Corps. And if it is, that means we would need a letter, some kind of documentation from the Corps saying that they approved the project moving forward. And so again, this is a lot more things that we have to deal with ahead of a grant agreement. And we're really focusing and trying to work out some ways to get provide guidance and get some of these things streamlined as much as we can. But as you can see, a lot of these involve outside organizations outside of Parks and Wildlife, and a lot of them are at the federal level. And as soon as you add the feds, it adds time. But again, not every project has to deal with all these. This is very, some of these are very specific to a specific project. And some of y'all are already in and y'all don't have to worry about it, but there's others on this call that will have to worry and think about these things. So we'll do our best to work with you on those. Okay, so how does it actually work with NPS? So again, we talked about all the things now that they want to see done prior to giving us a grant agreement. And so we've already talked about the pre-agreement compliance. So once we have all that in, then we can submit during, your grant coordinator will submit all your documentation and fill out all the federal forms, and we'll submit it to the NPS, National Park Service. So we had our window closed in July. Our next window is in January. And then there's another window, I believe it's in March, April in the spring. And so we'll be able to submit those during those windows. And then NPS, they take their time to review. In the past, there's a few months, but, again, just to drive it home, once we submit it to NPS, we're at the mercy of federal process. And so we can't really give you a strict timeline, but we do know that they're starting to trickle in and they're doing better. It's still just taking time for them to work out some details. Okay, so hey, you got all this, you're waiting for your grant agreement. What can you do to help kind of move your project along, even though you're waiting on a grant agreement? A big thing is, pre-agreement dates are really important in that. If you have a pre-agreement date for your project, that means you can start working on your design, specifications. You can do any kind of surveying or appraisals. And at Parks and Wildlife, we might have our biologists might have had some permitting requirements or something that they want to see at the state level that you can start working on, and just really trying to get a lot of those tasks that we're going to go through in more detail here in just a minute. But there's some tasks that you can start working on while you're waiting on your grant agreement. And if those cost money, if you have a pre-agreement date, we can help reimburse some of those based on a pre-agreement date. But even if that's not part of your scope and you're not asking for reimbursement for those things, you can at least have those ready so that once we do have a grant agreement in place, all it is uploading and getting you guys rocking and rolling and starting to build your project. All right. But one thing we cannot stress enough is you cannot start construction prior to having a grant agreement in place. However, again, we have two different segments of folks on this call right now. We have some folks on here that applied in 2019 and are still waiting on a grant agreement. And some of you folks that have been waiting for this long, y'all have donors that are, you know, really getting antsy or maybe even wanting to pull out of the project, or maybe you have, you know, you've been in contact with playground suppliers and you know, the cost increase coming up that you're really trying to say, hey, we need to get some construction or at least be able to spend some monies. For those projects, we do have something in place called a waiver of retroactivity for construction. And that means you can spend some monies on those elements prior to a grant agreement. However, if we can make a suggestion or recommendation, it's I would say if you can wait until you have a grant agreement in place, that is the most that would probably be the most conservative way to manage your grant. But if you were funded in 2019 and you have questions about whether or not you can start construction, please reach out to your grant coordinator so that we can talk through that process and what that's going to look like. Now, for all you folks that applied in 2020 and we just submitted your application to the National Park Service, there is no waiver in place for you all. We're really hoping that we have a grant agreement in place by this fall, and y'all won't have to worry about that. But either way, no construction can start on your projects until you have that grant agreement in place. So don't spend money, don't start acquiring properties if that's a part of your grant scope. Unless you have a waiver of retroactivities for acquisition. Again, if that's a project specific thing, and if it is, you would understand that, but if not, reach out to your grant coordinator about that. But again, we can't even get a reimbursement or anything like that. Even if you had pre-agreement dates with professional services and you spent money on surveys, or if you have design fees already that you've paid out, we can't reimburse those until you have a grant agreement. So really, we're really trying to get these grant agreements out the door, but we're just in a holding period. But don't start really spending money or working on your project until those agreements are in place. And definitely reach out to your coordinator if you have questions about timing and actual spending of any monies. Okay. So local agreements. So after once Parks and Wildlife gets an agreement from the National Park Service, what's going to happen is we'll get that direct deposit and that TINS form. Some of you, we already have that for. For some of the newer projects, we might, the ones that we just approved this last May, we might not have that for you yet. But those are two things that we're going to have to get that worked through. So if you haven't done that yet, you'll be seeing that pretty soon. So once we receive those, as the fiscal was saying, they'll work you into their system. They'll get you into our finance and accounting system, which will transfer into Argo 2020. And then at your project grant coordinator will get the maps, we'll get the budgets, we'll get all the tasks and everything set up, all the attachments, all that is set up in Argo 2020. And then you'll get notified that all that is in place and that we need you to sign that. Okay. We're really hoping that even for the 2019 projects and the 2020 projects that we're going to be working on that this fall. That is what we're really hoping for. So a grant agreement, what does that look like? So the period of performance, that really depends on when we receive it from the National Park Service. They'll kind of set that period of performance, which, following some normal processes would have been a September start date, for July submissions or March for January submissions. But we'll just see how they handle that. But you're going to want to look at your grant agreement and that first section up as soon as you look at it, that's where a lot of the nitty gritty information that you need to know is, how long do you have to do your project? How much is your share versus our federal share, and the total project cost? But let's kind of look through some of these. So this is what the grant agreement will look like. Again, this is going to be the main page with all the details, the description of your project. Make sure that we're all on the same page of what you asked for and what we're going to allow in terms of cost. Here's all your contact information. These are a ton of different sections on what you can expect on how to manage your grant, or expectations and legal requirements based on your grant. And then the last page here is where you'll actually sign it. And we really need 3 signatures to execute a grant agreement. We need this page I just showed you. We need the boundary map, and then we need something that's called a certification of land dedication form. So let's take a look at what those look like. So this is a typical boundary map. This is really important because, as most of you know, since you applied to this program, is whenever we put money into a project, that land has to remain parkland in perpetuity. So it cannot be used for anything other than parkland. So the boundary map is really important because that's what's going to show where that land is and where the project's going to take place. So what you're going to do is you'll see this boundary map. You're going to want to look it over really well. You're really going to look first at just what the boundary is. Is the boundary accurate? Does it look right? Two, if you have acquisition as part of your project, sometimes, you know, the whole property is part of the acquisition, but sometimes maybe you're doing an addition to a park, or you have, you know, it's not the whole area. You're going to want to look at the acquisition boundary to make sure that that's correct as well. And then dedicated open space, we're going to talk some more about that in detail, but essentially what that is some projects and some sponsors like to leave a certain area of their park untouched and as natural as possible. And so if that is part of your project, you know, we want to make sure we define that boundary as well. And again, the overall boundary is important. And then you want to look at the acreages as well. We'll list what the acreages are, and we try to get those as exact as we can. However, we have a means, it's called a meets and bounds survey that we'll explain here in just a little bit, that'll really dial in that acreage, but you want to make sure that it's at least as close as you can. The last thing is, you know, with the National Park Service, they really don't like overhead utility lines in parks that we funded. So most of the time we like to have those removed or buried or relocated, however it needs to work out. Now, sometimes that's not feasible because, you know, there are major transmission lines or something to that effect. And so we'll show on the map whether or not they're going to be relocated or buried, or if they're going to be allowed to remain. That just makes sure that we're all on the same page. And lastly, you know, we like to see somewhat of a layout of what the grant elements are and what we're paying for. You know, that's not an end-all be-all design. It's really just conceptual. But again, it helps show that this is what the project is. These are the elements that we're paying for, and this is how they're going to be distributed throughout the property. So these are going to be things that you want to look at for this boundary map before you sign it. But then we'll sign it, and you'll sign it. And the next thing is this certification of land dedication. So this form, again, every project we put money into has to have some kind of land dedication as parkland in perpetuity. And, you know, you have a resolution saying that you're going to do that. It's in the grant agreement, but this form right here just really just drives it home that that property will not be used for anything other than parkland. So this has to be signed as well. So what does that look like? How do you sign it? You know, Blake kind of went over a little bit earlier, and there's tons of guidance and resources in RGO 2020 to find out how to do this. But essentially, you're going to find your way to this page. You know, after we status change it, that it's in your court to sign and get executed, you'll get that email saying you have to sign your agreement. You'll find your way to this page. It's the agreement signatures page, and that link at the top, that's what's going to download those first few pages that I kind of went through a minute ago with all the nitty-gritty details of your grant project. So that's where you actually find that page. And then if you look down, you'll see the attachments section. Now there's going to be a ton of attachments that you're going to receive. You know, you'll have a budget summary that really details the grant items and the estimated amounts that they're going to cost. You're going to see the boundary map in this section. You're going to see the certification form in this section. And so those are where, so what you'll do is you'll say, you'll click on those, and that's where you'll click on these links under the document upload. You'll click on those links, and that's how you'll download, say, the boundary map and the certification form, so that you can have those signed. And then once you have those signed, as well as your agreement, you're going to want to scan all those into one PDF. And then if you go down to the bottom here, it says choose file, and it says sponsor agreement upload. That's where you will submit your PDF document to execute your grant agreement. One other thing we want to mention and kind of talk about is there's going to be some extra attachments that you're going to have to, that you're not going to have to sign, but they're there for reference. So let's go over some of those right quick. Most of these are really just talking about how the projects are going to be managed and what kind of manuals we're going to be following. But the first ones you're going to see is the TPWD resource review. That is the review and the comments that we received from the Parks and Wildlife biologist. We send every application to our biologist for a review. They're the ones that's going to tell you if you have any kind of, you know, permitting requirements either through the Corps or U.S. Fish and Wildlife, or, you know, even if there's no requirements, like actual permitting requirements, they have some best management practices and some things to think about for your design. So that's a really good one to look over. The THC review and concurrence, again, sometimes we submit every project to THC, and sometimes there's no ARC survey, there is no actual process to do. So it'll just say, hey, no survey required, this project is good to go. So we just want you to have that for your files. But if there is something that is going to be required, you know, we're going to have all that process that you went through to get it approved, and all the concurrence letters and all that stuff that you gave to us so that we could submit it to the National Park Service. All of that'll be in there just so it's all in one place. Next, we'll at least give you the attachment for the federal agreement. That way you can see what the agreement that Parks and Wildlife has with the National Park Service. We'll also give you an instructions for approved projects. This is basically your playbook. This is what you're going to want to look at and to know exactly what you need to do in terms of, you know, pre-construction task, you know, reimbursement requirements, appraisal requirements. Like, that is your playbook for how you need to manage your grant. Then we'll also attach the LWCF manual. That is the manual that the National Park Service kicks down, and that's basically our playbook at Parks and Wildlife. Those are all the policies and regs that we have to follow, and that's how we know if there's a question or an issue that comes up, how we need to make our decisions. So again, that's our playbook. And then the last one's the Texas Grant Management Standards, and really that's kind of more of Fiscal's playbook. They have a lot of their standards for finance and accountability and a lot of those things. So that's pretty much their playbook. And now, again, you don't have to sign any of these documents, but basically, being that they're a part of your agreement and they're an attachment, that you are agreeing to follow all these standards and all these policies and regs. So really, we encourage everybody to look at that. If you have somebody on your staff that just gets really excited about federal policy and grant management standards, I mean, Christmas can come early, and let them read all that stuff. But, you know, if there's some folks on here that maybe have trouble sleeping at night or suffer from insomnia, maybe this could also help you as well. But either way, you are basically signing, saying that you understand what's in all of these different documents. All right. Important, I want to drive it home one more time, that construction should not begin until you have a grant agreement in place. But again, for those folks that have been waiting for a really long time, we have a mechanism in place to allow you to start spending some money in construction, but please reach out to your grant coordinator before you do that, okay? Now, again, the exception is pre-agreement costs. You can start on design as long as you have a pre-agreement date associated with your application. And if you have questions about that, talk to your grant coordinator about that. All right, so let's say, hey, we finally get you a grant agreement in place. You're finally ready to rock and roll on your project. We're going to go through all the different tasks that you're going to be required to do. And I'm going to pass it to Matt here in a minute, and he's going to go through each one of these in detail. But the biggest thing I want to drive home right here is the ones that are on the screen now. These are ones that everybody is going to have to do for their project. These are pretty much required tasks for every single project that we fund. So, you know, we have accessibility requirements, stormwater, construction plans, and all these are pretty self-explanatory, but Matt is going to go into some detail on what we want to see for those. But again, these are required. Now, these are some other tasks that could be associated with your project, but these are really more, you know, project specific, and so they don't apply to everybody. So we'll go over some of these. Matt's going to go over some of these in his presentation. But we just want you to know that, you know, there are some other tasks that you might see, and you know, some involve just state level coordination, some involve federal level coordination, and some are really just at the local level. So if you look at this here, you know, we really want to demonstrate on this slide here that this is really our bureaucratic process slide here. You know, basically, if your project involves federal compliance or federal permitting in any way, I mean, those things can take a really long time to complete. We've seen them take up to a year. I've even seen them sometimes take longer than that. So if there's federal process, what we want to drive home is go ahead and start working on those things, or have a plan in place that you know what you need to do and how you need to work through those processes, because you got to expect that they're going to take time.
Yellow Book appraisal as an example. Now there could be some tasks that we can handle here at the state level. You know, our biologists, you know, there might be some things where they want to be in coordination with your project to make sure that the designs or your plans are you know, not having as big of an impact on the environmental resources, but doesn't have to go to the federal level, just something we can do at Parks and Wildlife. You know, those can still take months. You know, there's still going to be a lot of planning and coordination and some back and forth. But ultimately, we'll work out any issues, but there's still going to take some coordination. So they could take months if you're dealing at the state level. But then, you know, more the local level, the things that you can start working on, you know, plant list, interpretive signage, things like that. Some of those things that you can do at your either within your organization or that your design consultants or whoever it is, they can work on some of those and they'll submit those in Argo and really it's just working with your grant coordinator to get those reviewed. Those usually don't take very long. We ask for 30-day review periods and sometimes we get really busy and there's a lot of grants that we're managing now. I mean, we have a whole lot more of a workload. So we're trying to keep it within the 30 days, but a lot of times for some of these smaller tasks, we can get those done within a week or two as soon as we get notified, you know, so it's just want to give you some expectations on timelines. But no matter what, LWCF grants do take longer process, right? So just know that this is the long game once we're dealing with these federal grants. All right. Last thing, so how you actually manage your task in the Argo system. So we kind of went over this, Blake went over this, some of that, and there's some resources that you can really find some details, but essentially once we get a grant agreement in place, your project coordinator, your grant coordinator is going to come in here and they're going to upload some documents for you to sign. The really good thing about this new system is if like say where it says direct deposit form here, that's actually going to be a link. And so you'll be able to click on that link. And if it's just a straight form, there'll be a blank copy that you can just fill out. But if it's something that involves process or step-by-step guides, that's where we have created step-by-step guides for all the different tasks. You'll be able to click that link and be able to know exactly what it is we're expecting from you. All right. So once you do that, once you get all those steps completed and you have the form filled out or the process done, you'll come over here to the sponsor upload section. You'll choose the file and you'll upload it. And as soon as you upload it, we'll get an email saying that you've completed a task. Now, we don't have it shown here, but see these green check marks? That means that the task has been approved. And you can also see over here at the end where it says verified and complete. That means those tasks have been approved. There's nothing else you need to do. There's another symbol that we don't have shown here, but it's basically a big triangle with the yellow triangle with an exclamation point. And that means that you have done what you need to do on your side as a sponsor. And that means that now it's on us here at Parks and Wildlife to review it and provide comment or to approve it. And so what that looks like is, you know, we'll click on your link here, we'll review your document. And if everything looks good and it's no more changes, we'll click verified and complete, we'll save it and you'll get a green check mark. However, if there's an issue or something that we need to change or you need to add some extra information, there's further documentation, we're going to click on this changes required button. We're going to type in this little section here, whatever it is that we need to see or what you need to remedy. We'll save that and then you're going to get an email saying, okay, you have to modify, you have to add, you have to change. And so then you go in and you fix those changes, upload it again, and hopefully everything will be right with the world and we can just verify and complete after that. Okay. But yeah, basically that's where we're showing down here, more information required. All right, so that's how the project task list works. And so that's how you're actually going to manage your grant. Now we're going to go into the real details of the different tasks, and I'm going to pass it over to Matt Fugere to do that.
Hey everyone, thanks Aaron. My name is Matt Fugere, and I am a project coordinator along with Aaron and Susan Sharp. And as I was looking through the attendee list, it was good to see some familiar names, so welcome everyone. As Aaron laid out, there are a number of project management tasks that we require. In this portion of the presentation, we'll be going over the task in a bit more detail. So first off, I'll start with what is a change in how we've handled the process, specifically in dealing with LDBCF applications from in the past. As Aaron mentioned, NPS is now requiring full compliance prior to submission of an LDBCF application. So I'll just repeat that. A lot of this full compliance has to be done prior to submission of an LDBCF application. As far as timelines are concerned, this is a significant change to our process. Now, clearances for certain requirements must be obtained in the pre-agreement stage. And as has been noted, we do expect this change to continue to be policy moving forward, so that's just what our expectation will be from this point on. One of the pre-agreement clearances required in the pre-agreement stage is an assurance of compliance with the National Historic Preservation Act. In your pre-agreement meeting, you may remember your grant coordinator mentioning that we submit recommended projects to the Texas Historical Commission, or THC for short, for initial review as part of the award process. The purpose for submitting to THC is they are the state agency responsible for ensuring National Historic Preservation Act compliance. Now, if a survey has been conducted in the past, or there are known to be no archaeological or historical resources at the site, THC will provide project clearance in this initial review. For those lucky projects, this clearance is enough. However, for projects not provided initial clearance, an additional historic resources survey conducted by a professional, such as a licensed archaeologist, may be required. If additional survey work is required, it will be noted on your THC review summary. Any additional survey work is the responsibility of the sponsor. However, do note that the cost of the work can be reimbursed as professional services. If your project does require additional survey work, please refer to the link provided on this slide to get started, or feel free to reach out to one of us if you have any questions. Once a survey has been performed, a report will need to be submitted to THC for concurrence. Compliance is assured when that clearance is provided by the Texas Historical Commission. The concurrence letter you receive from THC is what needs to be uploaded to the RGO 2020 specific task line, as Aaron was pointing out in the previous slide. It is worth repeating here, THC concurrence needs to be obtained during the pre-agreement compliance phase for our federal projects. We cannot start the NPS grant submission process or generate a grant agreement until this task has been completed. Another pre-agreement compliance task we would like to discuss is an environmental assessment. Your grant coordinator will have informed you if this requirement pertains to your project during your pre-agreement meeting. Like the Texas Historical Commission task, EAs must be completed before submitting the project to NPS and generating your grant agreement. EAs are required in two situations. First, any project with more than minor impacts to the project site must complete an assessment to see if there are significant impacts that must be mitigated. This will be determined by TPWD subject matter experts and the NPS Omaha office. Second, any project that includes acquisition and development must complete an environmental assessment, regardless of the impact to the environment. This is a requirement from the National Park Service, and we cannot grant any exceptions or exemptions in this case. An environmental assessment is a lengthy task. So if your project requires this task and you have not started it, you want to do this, get it started as soon as possible. It does require the generation of the assessment, also a recommended 30-day minimum public comment period, and if there's no significant environmental impacts are found, it does require the generation of a finding of no significant impact statement, or FONSI for short. To repeat once more, both the THC clearance and environmental clearance must be provided during the pre-agreement phase before a federal application can be submitted to NPS for LWCF funds. Now, for the remainder of the task we'll be discussing in the coming slides, they're not explicitly required for the federal application. Typically, these required tasks are completed following the execution of a local grant agreement. Now, the first of these tasks, again, typically completed following the execution of the local grant agreement, is the registration of the project with the Texas Department of Licensing and Regulation, or TDLR for short. TDLR registration is required for all projects. This registration is meant to ensure that the project meets federal and state accessibility standards under the Americans with Disabilities Act, commonly referred to as ADA, as well as the elimination of the Architectural Barriers Act. On this slide, you can see a screenshot of the TDLR website, as well as links that can be used to help get your projects registered. But once you do have it registered, you will receive a registration confirmation page from TDLR. This page includes your project-specific number. Now, this is the document that should be uploaded into the RGO 2020 in the item task line. Providing proof of registration will meet our requirements, but please note, it is up to the sponsor to hire a registered accessibility specialist. This is typically referred to as a RAS. And also note that a RAS final inspection report may be required to ensure the project fully meets accessibility requirements. Another project management task required of all projects is the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, or TCEQ, stormwater permit for construction activities. In this slide, you can see a screenshot of TCEQ's website. A link to the website is also provided. Although this task is required of all projects, the specific requirements vary according to the size of the project and its potential area of disturbance. Now, I'm going to go into that in a little more detail in the coming slides, but be aware that specifications for the TCEQ stormwater permit can be included in construction plans. Similar to our RGO 2020, to facilitate receipt and review of the stormwater permit, TCEQ utilizes an electronic document receiving system with the conveniently Texas appropriate acronym of STEERS, which stands for the State of Texas Environmental Electronic Reporting System. Once again, please note that the sponsor is responsible for submitting and ensuring TCEQ's requirements are met. To meet this requirement, the size of your project does matter, as I stated earlier, as the stormwater permits do vary by level of site disturbance. According to TCEQ, there are 3 categories: sites with disturbance less than 1 acre, sites with disturbance between 1 and 5 acres, and sites with disturbance greater than 5 acres. On this slide, you'll see a flow chart that can be used to determine your project requirements. Don't worry about this slide, though. Don't worry if you're initially confused by the flow chart. I'm going to be going over the requirements in the following slide. However, I can say congratulations to those projects with disturbance less than 1 acre. You have it easy. You are exempt from the permit. You will still be required to note this in RGO 2020, however. For those projects with disturbance greater than 1 acre, there is a little bit more to the process. Sites with disturbance between 1 and 5 acres are considered small construction activities. In order to receive the TCEQ permit, these sites will be required to file a notice of intent and a general permit. Moreover, sites with disturbance greater than 5 acres are considered large construction activities. And in addition to filing a notice of intent and a general permit, are required to provide a stormwater pollution prevention plan, or SWPPP. Links to the website of each respective category are located on this slide if you need some help. Another of our requirements is construction plans and specifications. In order to ensure that all grant elements and sustainability requirements are included in the project scope, we do require 100% signed and sealed construction plans and specs for each project. Now, the plans may be sealed by an architect, a landscape architect, or engineer. For standalone pre-manufactured items, which we commonly see, such as pavilions or playground equipment, manufacturers can often provide the signed and sealed plans, so feel free to work with them directly. If you have any specific questions regarding the plan specs, please feel free to reach out to your grant coordinator. Here it is helpful to reiterate that no construction should occur prior to receiving the notice to proceed, what we call the NTP from us. The notice to proceed will not be provided until the plans and specs have been approved. So for projects purchasing items from a purchasing co-op, as was discussed earlier in the presentation, like buy board, manufacturer cut sheets are acceptable. Now, if your grant includes funds for landscaping, we do have some specific requirements. First of all, only native plants are eligible for reimbursement. As I like to tell sponsors, you can plant whatever you want, but as a conservation organization, we're only going to reimburse you for planting native plants. Now, to ensure that only native plants are reimbursed, we do require that a plant list landscape plan be submitted for approval prior to planting. We will review this list and determine what is native and eligible for reimbursement and what is not. For those who are not master naturalists, a really helpful tool for determining native species is the native plant database provided by the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center. A link to the database is found on this slide. Additionally, we will verify the plant material during the final inspection. We do have one exception to the native plant requirement, and that is Bermuda grass may be used and reimbursed if planted within designated ball fields, but this is only within designated ball fields. Now, in order to ensure that the projects are progressing in a timely manner, consistent with our program, we do require a quarterly status report or QSR to be submitted for each project. How to do so has been discussed earlier in this presentation. A QSR is due on or before the 15th of January, April, July, and October. As a reminder, you will receive an email notification from RGO 2020 2 weeks prior to the deadline. All QSRs will be submitted through the RGO 2020 Business Management System. You may remember that my colleague, Systems Analyst Blake Powers, presented the procedures for submitting the QSR earlier in the presentation. Now, our new system is intended to be very user-friendly, but if you have any issues submitting your QSR, again, please feel free to reach out to us for help. So as a conservation organization, we also try to incentivize conservation through this program. So during the scoring process, applications receive points for proposals which provide conservation of natural open space that is 2 acres or larger in size. Dedicated open space is one of the most commonly misunderstood concepts in our program. So when we talk about dedicated open space, what do we mean? In terms of our program, open space is a special designation of an area of land and or water. Typically, this is a healthy native ecosystem that would be protected from most human development in perpetuity. Most commonly, these are specific areas of a park, typically heavily wooded native habitat or native grass and wildflower prairies, where the intent is to keep the area in or restore it to a natural state. Limited development is permitted within the dedicated open space. This is usually in the form of a trail. However, common park elements such as dog parks, sports fields, play areas, manicured lawns, and native landscaped areas are not eligible to be dedicated as open space. Although not all of your projects have dedicated open space, for those that do, there are some specific requirements. First, projects with dedicated open space require a special resolution. Now, this resolution as evidence of protection for dedicated natural areas, natural open space, and/or wetlands must be adopted by the governing body, such as a county court or city council. And this should be uploaded to the RGO 2020 website. A link to some sample resolutions are included on this slide if you need a little guidance. Second, the area dedicated as open space must remain open, natural space, relatively free of man-made structures in perpetuity. To ensure that the area is defined and so that we can locate the dedicated area during a compliance inspection, the area of open space must be included on the meets and bounds survey, as well as the official boundary map. In terms of signage, we also have some requirements. A temporary sign is required for all projects. The temporary sign should be a minimum of 4 foot by 8 foot. Examples of temporary signs can be found in the item request email you received from RGO 2020. Additionally, a general template, including the required verbiage for the sign, can be found on page 24 of the instructions for approved projects packet you received attached to your grant agreement. Now, again, I like to explain to my sponsors that the required verbiage is what has to be included on the sign. However, feel free to add additional elements like logos or conceptual renderings to the sign as well to help spice things up. We do require that a proof of the temporary sign be sent to us via RGO 2020 again for approval prior to fabrication. The temporary sign should be placed on site prior to construction and removed prior to the grand opening. We also require a permanent sign or plaque to be installed at every one of our projects. Like the temporary sign, the examples of the permanent sign can be found linked to the RGO 2020 item request, as well as the general template with required verbiage found on page 25 of the instructions for approved projects. Also, like the temporary sign, additional info beyond the required verbiage, such as a seal, council board members, project funders, etc., they are acceptable. Again, we do require that a proof of the permanent sign is uploaded to RGO 2020 for approval prior to fabrication. Unlike the temporary sign, the permanent sign is smaller. We only require 18 by 24 inch minimum, and it must be on site in perpetuity. So you will want to make sure that it's durably fabricated with some common materials being cast aluminum plaques or screen printed metals are also common. You'll also want to make sure that it's installed in a relatively safe location. If the permanent sign is stolen, defaced, or no longer legible, the sponsor is responsible for having it replaced. So not all projects have interpretive signage, but for those that are unsure what some do, and for those that are unsure what actually constitutes an interpretive sign, a simple definition for interpretive signage is anything that provides information about the natural or cultural environment on site. Again, if you need any further clarification, please feel free to contact your grant coordinator. But ultimately, the design, format, and content of the interpretive signage is largely up to the sponsor. Now, although the requirements are not as strict for the interpretive signage as for the temporary and permanent signs, we do require that a proof of the signage be uploaded to RGO 2020 for approval prior to fabrication. In this case, we're not really looking for specific required verbiage, but we are wanting to make sure that the content is scientifically accurate and does support the Texas Parks and Wildlife mission. Now, another one of our more misunderstood requirements is a meets and bounds survey map. As meets and bounds survey is required for all, a meets and bounds survey is required for all projects. The purpose of the meets and bounds survey is to accurately delineate and create a record of the actual boundary that will be dedicated as parkland in perpetuity. Meets and bounds survey maps are most commonly provided by a licensed surveyor. However, they do not have to be. We will also accept a CAD-generated map created by a city engineer, for example. Additionally, existing meets and bounds surveys, even if they are a number of years old, are perfectly acceptable, so long as the project boundary can be clearly identified. Moreover, if your project site has received federal or state funding in the past, we may already have a survey on file. For projects that fit the description, I do recommend contacting your grant coordinator to determine if what we have on file will meet the requirements. This concludes my portion of the presentation. For the remainder, I will be turning it over to my colleague, Susan Sharp. Susan, feel free to take it away.
Hi there, folks. Really good to see so many familiar names here today. I think my screen is showing. Hi, Ben. Hi, Cindy. Hi, Deborah. Hi, Joe. Hi, Catherine. Hi, Leah. Hi, Maggie. Hi, Omar. Hi, Patty. Hi, Ray. And hi, Susan Ivy. Hello. Okay, so we will get started today. And hi to everyone else as well. Those are just some of my folks who I know have been, who I've been working with. Some are new friends and some I've been working with for quite a few years now. So moving on to the final portion of the presentation, don't worry, we're in the home stretch. I just have to get through a few more slides and we'll set you on your way for the afternoon. And I'm going to start by talking about amendments. And amendments are a special beast for Land and Water Conservation Fund projects. Land and Water Conservation Fund projects, you know, we have to submit everything to the federal government. It just can take a little bit more time to get things done. So we can accept time extension amendments though for any LWCF grant. We can accept any extension that is 1 year in length. I do have a test case where I'm going for a 2-year extension for one of my active projects. We'll see if that works. We'll see how hard it is. And if that's the case, we may be having some different guidance on this next year. But for the time being, we can allow you to request a 1-year time extension amendment to the grant project period. In order to do this, though, you're going to have to give us some documentation. This might be a little bit more than you've had to give in the past if you've worked with us on other state or federal grants. So the first is that you have to establish the cause of the delay, why you need more time than the period of performance. You need to indicate which grant elements still need to be completed. You need to give assurances that the additional time will help you actually complete the project. And then from all of that, your grant coordinator will take it, package it up to an amendment, and submit it to MPS. I do have on my screen that approval can take months. Lately, I've been receiving some verbal approval that it will go through, and then it just is taking a longer time to get through their new system. This is a similar sort of administrative delay that we've had with getting the grant agreements out at all. However, we'll know that if they're approved or not earlier than that. But because of these delays, and we're going to keep on expecting them until we see that they're not happening anymore. Because of this, we're going to ask that you please request any extension at least 3 months before your grant expires. And it's likely your project coordinator will be in touch with you and will let you know that the term is ending and that you need to get an extension. But if not, please do keep that in mind. 3 months before your period of performance is over, if you're not going to make it, it's time to request a 1-year project extension. Oh, it'd be great if my slide would go. There we go. Okay, so we do have a new change here for LWCF grants and scope change amendments. And we are highly discouraging scope change amendments for LWCF grants unless there's no other way to work it out. And the reason we're highly discouraging a scope change amendment for your LWCF grant is because it has become a lengthier, more time-consuming process than it has been in the past. It takes a lot of effort on your part and on our part. You know, we have to do the full suite of SF424 forms. We have to create pages of documentation. It just takes a lot of time and effort. And that being said, it's not guaranteed that it will be accepted by NPS. With all the delays we've been experiencing, we think that these can interfere with the timeline and can interfere with your ability to get it done. And then a brand new change, and this is the reason I have all these exclamation points all over the slide, is that changes to the grant scope that will change the area of ground disturbance or the prism of ground disturbance will trigger NEPA and National Historic Preservation Act compliance. So those were those pre-agreement compliance tasks that we spent a lot of time talking about. We might have to do them all over again if it's a different site or if the site is bigger. So your grant coordinator has worked with you to create a grant scope that is as flexible as possible to avoid the need for a scope change amendment. We use general language. We try to avoid putting specific materials or quantities into your grant agreement to afford you some wiggle room. And this simple, flexible project scope helps avoid the need for most scope change amendments in the first place. So what constitutes a scope change amendment? First and foremost, it's going to be changing the elements in the project scope or the budget. So in this example we have here, this is the budget page. This is what you see on your grant project on Recreation Grants Online. Let's say you need to take out exercise equipment and you're going to put in parking instead. That is a change to what is in the scope of the grant. It's in your budget summary, it's in the agreement. That's when you would need a scope change amendment. The other way that you could need a scope change amendment is if you're changing the project site. So that doesn't happen very often, but just please do keep that in mind, that if you're changing the location of your grant from one park to another, if the environmental and cultural resources studies and review that we did during the grant application doesn't apply to the site anymore, that would also require a scope change amendment. Any scope change amendment does require a rescore of the project. We want to make sure that folks aren't applying with one project scope and then getting the grant and then radically changing it when there could have been, changing it for the worse, I should say, when there could have been a project just a few slots down below the funding line that would have ended up being a better project. So we need to make sure that any changes to the project scope stay there, keep your project above the funding line. And then again, this may not be approved. So before going through an amendment request, be in touch with your project coordinator. We can help you figure out if indeed you need one. We might be able to come up with some creative solutions that don't require going down this route. So you don't need an amendment request in all situations either. So if you are just changing the amount of money spent on a line item in your grant agreement, you don't need to submit a scope change amendment. As long as the total construction budget is remaining the same, as long as all of those grant elements are in construction, they're in your plans and specifications, they're going to be on the ground when the project is done, you don't need an amendment. So again, for an example, here, if you're going to keep your exercise equipment, pavilion, and play area as they were, but oops, exercise equipment ended up costing $60,000, but oh boy, your play area ended up only costing $50,000. We don't need to go through a scope change amendment in this case. You're just fine. We'll capture that in your reimbursement request. It'll be captured in the grant otherwise. So just a few more details on the scope change amendment, because this is another thing that has changed in this new wave of processes and procedures that we're implementing kind of on the fly here. So a scope change amendment includes any change to a grant element. So that's element deletions or element additions. And then if there's any changes to the area or prism of disturbance. So this can include additional removal of vegetation. If your site is previously undisturbed and you're going to, expand your construction area, you're going to do site work and mobilization and landscaping changes over especially natural undisturbed vegetation. Or if you're going to do any expansions or changes to areas of soil disturbance. It's going to be a pretty significant undertaking. And so what do I mean by expansion or changes to areas of soil disturbance? That means if the soil disturbance, if the impact of your project goes in any direction or deeper than what was submitted in your application. And when we submit our applications, we are pretty good about including the whole park boundary. Though we include the whole park boundary in our analysis of cultural resources and environmental resources. So, usually this isn't going to be something that would come up in your project, but if it does, it's something that we're going to want to know as soon as possible. And that's because if new areas are disturbed, if areas are disturbed that were not evaluated during the application and during the pre-agreement phase, we basically have to restart that whole process. And this is incredibly burdensome, especially for you. It's time consuming for us. We're going to have to get Texas Historical Commission to review everything again. There's that 30-day review period. You might have to do NEPA, which would require an environmental assessment. You'll have to do 30 days of a public comment period. It's just going to be a lot. So that's why we are highly, highly discouraging scope change amendments for LWCF funded grants. Again, this is for federally funded grants. So if you're working on projects that have state dollars, the situation with amendments is different. We can do scope changes for states and not time extension for states. So this is, again, why we also split up our webinar into 2 days. So this is specifically for LWCF grants here. All right. Okay, just a little emphasis there. So how to request an amendment. So if you do need an extension, or if you've worked with your grant coordinator and we've decided that you do need to go ahead and request a scope change amendment, the full instructions are on Argo 2020. If you click the resources tab, you can click on the awarded active project resources. You can click on how to submit an amendment, revision request, and you will be taken to a lovely YouTube video where Blake walks you through it step by step. So that resource is there and it's available for you. So moving towards the closeout process, this is another process that differs a little bit with our state funded grants. I mean, the major building blocks are the same, but again, just pay attention if you are someone who's administering both. So the construction needs to be complete, and that has to be completed by the end date of your period of performance. That's going to be in your grant agreement. It's going to be in the agreement we receive from the federal government, and that is what we can extend by 1 year if it's well reasoned with an amendment request. At that point, we will need to do a final inspection. You can request that in your quarterly report, and we'll come out there and do a visit. What we're checking for there is to make sure that the grant scope has been fulfilled. At that point, you're eligible to, if you pass your final inspection, you're eligible to request the full 100% of your reimbursement. If you've already requested 100% of your reimbursement prior to the final inspection, they'll just withhold 5% of that amount, and that final 5% can be released after the final inspection. And then we move into a project completion phase, and you get to enjoy the park with your community. So it seems like it might be a long way off for some of you, but it's time to think now about how you will expend your funds and complete your construction within 3 days from your start date. We've all had a lot of challenges in construction and administering funds over the past 18 months. But beyond that, there's more and more weather events. Most of our projects, have something significant happen to them, whether it's a freeze or flooding or a hurricane. We've seen a lot of changes and fluctuations in material costs. We've seen changes and fluctuations in the availability of labor. And then we also see staff turnover within your organization. And staff turnover can lead to a lot of delays because we basically have to retrain everyone. And, sometimes the keys aren't left in the ignition for the next person who steps on. So I would ask everyone on this call today, if you are planning on leaving your organization before maybe you're not planning to, maybe you have to leave your organization before your grant period is up, please make sure that these grant materials are accessible, that they're findable for the people who will be stepping into your shoes. And then the first bullet point on there was your project management tasks. So if you have something that's going to take a while, the good thing with these LWCF grants is that the lengthiest tasks take place before you get your grant agreement. So you can pretty much just run right into construction and some of the smaller, less lengthy project tasks at the point of your grant agreement. Pretty much the longest project management task is going to be the Yellow Book appraisal and Yellow Book appraisal review. So if you have that in your project, get it started right away. We do see some challenges with that and compressing project timelines. So for LWCF grants, that's going to be the one to watch out for in how you space your project. But the silver lining of the pre-agreement phase in these LWCF grants is that we take care of all of these super lengthy tasks before you even have a grant agreement. When it's time for you to schedule a final inspection, your grant coordinator will come out. We'll meet you on site. We'll take a tour of the park that we've built together, or you've built with a few of our dollars, or federal dollars, and we'll be looking to make sure that everything that was in the project budget, like all those grant element line items, are installed and that they're on the ground. Those will be spelled out in your grant agreement, in the scope, and in the budget summary. Oftentimes, I will literally take a screenshot of the budget summary and walk around and scribble little check marks over it on my phone to make sure that they're all there. So that's what we're looking for. And then sometimes the program sign is not included in your project budget, but whether or not it is, we will be looking for that. That is a final requirement. The program sign is oftentimes the thing that makes a final inspection not fail, but it often needs to be remedied. You can get your project sign installed, your permanent project sign installed before the park is ready if you need to. I understand a lot of people wait till the end because it can be a fun part of making your park open to the public, but there's no reason to wait till the end to get your program sign. And we can, if the program sign isn't installed, again, you're not going to get the final 5% of your reimbursement request because the project will not be considered complete. So speaking of unveiling signs, oftentimes people like to do that at ribbon cutting ceremonies. And I know that a lot of you like to do groundbreaking ceremonies when construction starts. We love to attend those when we can. It's not always possible, but it really is a good opportunity for us to meet with you, for us to see project progress, for us to get some FaceTime together, and just interface face-to-face on how the project is going. And also, I know I really appreciate it because I love parks. That's why I'm in this job, but I spend most of my time behind a desk. So being out there, being in the field, seeing what I do all day behind a computer is actually doing in the real world can be pretty rewarding and energizing. So please do invite us. And if possible, a Recreation Grant staff member will attend. And increasingly, at least for me and my projects in far South Texas and in the Rio Grande Valley, if I can't attend, sometimes I can send a state park superintendent or assistant superintendent over, and that's really fun for both the community to get to know our state park staff and for the state park staff to see the Texas Parks and Wildlife Mission happening on the local level. So once your park is open to the public, our relationship doesn't end. We don't send you off into the sunset right away. After your project is completed, we will want to check in about once a year for the first 5 years to just see how everything's going. We haven't had a formal process for annual self-reports for these first 5 years. We may be developing that. But if not, just don't be surprised if we reach out, a year after project closeout and say, hey, how's it going? Everything working right? This is really an opportunity for us to collect data on how well the parks and the grant elements that we're funding are working in the field, and it can help us. It's just a really good feedback loop for us when we're scoring applications or providing technical assistance. So it's just a nice touch point there for us to stay in communication with each other. After the first 5 years, we will do our post-completion inspections about once every 5 years. So every 5 years after your project is closed, someone from Texas Parks and Wildlife should be out in the field looking at your project. What we're checking for is grant element maintenance, and that's 25 years for outdoor elements. So if your grant includes a playground, we're going to want to see that the playground is there for 25 years after the project closeout period. If an inspector comes out, they see the playground isn't there, you're going to get an email or a letter, and we're going to say, where's the playground? And you're going to have to put a playground back up there. That time period is actually extended for pools and indoor facilities where it's a bigger investment. So pools need to last for 40 years. Indoor facilities are not eligible for LWCF, so I forgot to take that out, sorry. But if you do have a pool project, it needs to last for 40 years. And these TPWD inspections, these post-completion inspections will continue in perpetuity because the parkland is dedicated in perpetuity. What do we mean by this, and what are we checking for? It means that no non-recreational elements can be added within the project boundary. This is things like, it can range from like, is there a Wendy's? Is there a Taco Bell in your park? It has happened. To, is there a wastewater facility that someone put in because, they didn't know that this park had a state or federal interest in it, and they just needed somewhere to put a water facility. No non-recreational elements. It has to be parkland. So that means if your elements have outlived their useful life, say your playground is 30 years old, you can take down the playground. You just can't put in a Taco Bell. We're also checking to make sure that the park is safe and open to the public. So is it going to cause harm to people who visit it? Can people visit it? This is pretty basic stuff. We do check to make sure that the permanent sign is in place. That's why Matt advised you to put it in an area that's hard to dislodge or in a secure location. And then finally, we are looking to ensure that the boundaries are protected. So LWCF grants are protected by Section 6F of the Land and Water Conservation Act. And this is a pretty strong federal protection. If in the event there is a change to the project boundaries, you'll have to go through a conversion process, and it is not fun. If this is something that you think you might need to do, if the boundaries are going to change, we need to establish that during the active project period. It's much harder and much more burdensome to do after the project is closed. And if anyone is curious about that, I'm happy to put you in touch with some folks who are going through federal conversions right now. They can tell you that it's better to find an alternative. But anyway, we're all parks and recreation professionals. We're all people who are trying to get recreational facilities and parklands into communities across the state. And so the parkland being dedicated in perpetuity is kind of the reason that we're all here today. We have over 3,000 sites in the state of Texas. that have participated in our program and that are dedicated parkland sites. Your project will become one of those. We'll add to the ranks. And that means that all the work that we're doing now, all of the red tape, all of the changes, all of the delays, the COVID, the grants.gov windows not opening, all these changes, these are just a blink in the eye compared to how long this park is going to be around and serving your community. So we can all feel really good about that today. So we have made it to the end of the talking at you portion. So I'm gonna pop out the questions and see if there's any that we want to reiterate for the group, and you can continue to add your questions to the box. So if there's something that you were curious about and we didn't cover, or you want some clarification, if you just want me to keep talking, you can throw a question in the question box and I'll get to it. In the meantime, I'm going to kind of refresh over some of the questions that have come up. So of course, everyone's wondering when they will get their grant agreement. Erin covered that extensively. It's out of our hands for most of these. If you are going in the December window, the best thing we can do to hurry along the grant agreement process is to make sure that all the pre-agreement compliance tasks are done and that we won't receive a lot of scrutiny about them during the MPS review process. Can we put together the bid documents, but not put out to bid prior to local TPWD agreement, prior to getting that? Yes, you can. And in fact, I have authorized at least one of my projects to even go out to bid based on a risk assessment we did of when the grant agreement is likely to come and the costs and materials already being accelerated and pretty high at this point. We felt pretty confident that the bids would stay good if there was a continued delay with getting the LW self-grant agreement, but that really is something that you kind of have to know the facts about the project. But you can certainly put the bid documents together while you're waiting. And while we're also waiting for LWCF grant agreements, we can review like pretty much any pre-construction task. So if you have your construction plans and specifications and they're ready to go, I will set up that task in the project elements form ahead of time, and we can take a look at it and make sure that you're all teed up and ready to go as soon as we get that local agreement. Will EAs and categorical exclusion examples and definitions be available in Argo? Yes. So we have an environmental assessment technical assistance document that's there right now. We did our best to explain the situation and the categorical exclusions that are available. To those of you who are unfamiliar with NEPA and categorical exclusions, and this is just a bunch of mumbo jumbo words coming out of my mouth, get with your grant coordinator. We're happy to explain it to you. EA is environmental assessment, NEPA is National Environmental Protection Act, and categorical exclusions are specific codes that can help us avoid an environmental assessment process for certain projects that are taking place in existing parks. Where do we find our pre-agreement date? There is a place in the budget form on Recreation Grants Online for a pre-agreement date. You would have been asked to fill that out during the application phase. I review that, and your project coordinator should have reviewed it with you during a pre-agreement site visit meeting. I tend to go ahead and put one in, even if there's going to be no professional services associated with the project and the project budget, kind of just in case. My default is I usually will put in the date that you supplied the application to TPWD if there's nothing else in there. But that is something that you can discuss with your project coordinator. All the pre-agreement tasks, is that the case with state funded grants? No, it is not. we did our state-funded grant webinar yesterday, and we'll have a recording of those slides available as well. So there are some significant differences. The major one is that we have to move up these compliance tasks into a pre-agreement phase for the federal grants. Another big one is the amendments. So as I stated today, we are discouraging scope change amendments, but allowing time extension amendments. For state-funded grants, it is opposite. We are no longer doing time extension amendments. We are just building in the longest period of time off the bat, and we are still considering scope change amendments. So that's very confusing. That's why we have the two webinars. Timelines for TPWD to review and approve signage. Just speaking for myself, that's easy peasy. If it's taking a long time, it's probably because I missed the notification. You can just email or call me, and I think that's probably the case for everyone else. Well, I don't see any other questions coming up here, so I guess by talking for, let's see, 2.5 hours, you know, we covered everything, but just to reiterate, these slides will be available on the resources page of Recreation Grants Online, as will a link to the recording. So if you just really want to hear me talk about scope change amendments again, you'll be able to do it as much as you want. And with that, I will pass it back over to the folks over in Airport Commerce Park, unless any other questions come in.
Thanks, Susan. That'll conclude the webinar for today, everybody. So you'll be able to view this recording within 5 to 7 days on the Argo 2020 resources. Until that time, if you have any questions, you can reach out to our staff and we'll be happy to answer those. Appreciate y'all attending today, and we'll look forward to hearing from you guys if you have any questions.